Buongiorno. Hello, everybody. Anybody online, thank you very much for being here today. I'm going to start talking about a story here. A strange story because back in the spring I was meant to travel to San Marino, the Republic of San Marino. In fact, I did go to San Marino, but I wanted to go there to do other things, including collecting some evidence about their food cultures. And then, because it was a long journey, so we stopped at a place called Imola. You may have heard Imola because of Formula One. It's also at the central region called Romagna, as you can see here. Yeah. I'm not getting paid by them, by the way, unfortunately. And I met, the person who is arguably the best-known food historian in Europe, certainly the best-known historian about what is Italian food, or what you mean by Italian food. And so after that, a couple of weeks later, I received an email from people I didn't know, to be honest with you, and it's called from Casa Artusi. And they say, what is Casa Artusi? What has it got to do with these areas for a second? And they asked me to go there in June at the Festa Artusiana. Now, Festa Artusiana, it may mean nothing to you, but in Forlimpopoli, which is a small town in Romagna, every year there is a festival. Well, crikey, there are many food festivals. No, this is different, because this is to do with a specific person. Now, Pellegrino Artusi was an entrepreneur, and he was born in 1820, died in 1911. And what he did is that when he was 70, he published a book, which is this one here. This is a new edition, La scienza in cucina e l'arte di mangiar bene, Science of the Kitchen and the Art of Eating Well. Now, why am I saying this? Now, this book was then interpreted as being the first book, so it's the most important book of Italian cooking. Okay, I won't enter the details of this because obviously, there is a lot of things to be said. Obviously, one thing is interpretation, one thing is the real thing. And the interesting thing about this, and there was a talk, and they asked me to talk about food which can be called as Italian in inverted commas for certain reasons. And for other reasons, it could be called Italian. And that's why it's important to you that I mention Pellegrino Artusi. Now, you can see the taste of Romagna. Now, for example, interesting things, should you read Artusi, you'll find out that pizza, for Artusi, they included 3 types of pizza, and in those days, at least for Artusi, pizza was a sweet thing, it wasn't savory. We know that savory pizza existed already around the 1820s, and some dictionaries completely ignored it, okay, just to put it into perspective. So why I'm saying this, because when we talk about food, and we'll see this in a minute, you've got, everybody's an expert, we'll see in a minute, or the grandmother's an expert, so to speak. But the reality is that we are often surrounded by myths. And this is something we're going to look at in a minute. But let's go away now from Casa Artusi, which I encourage you to visit, because you will find out why, for example, pasta is cooked in a certain way and not, and you have to forget the myths of the grandmother. Because if you went to Forlimpopoli, you look at exhibitions, then you will see a little bit of history of food, done in a scientific way and not in, granny's recipes. Nothing against grandmother, by the way, okay, just in case you think I'm discriminated against them. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that the word Italian has to be contextualized, which is why I put it I use these inverted commas. And it's outside of Italy. Of course, we're not going to talk about, any kind of Italian food around the world, which is why he says it's the case of the autochthonous food cultures in the Swiss Alps and on the Eastern Adriatic coast, namely in Switzerland, but also we'll see a little bit of a part close to Switzerland, which is part of Italy. There are good reasons for that. And also we're going to look at parts of Switzerland, a little bit of Italy, and then we go into Slovenia, Croatia, and Montenegro. Now, I did something similar, not specifically about food cultures in January. But in the meantime, I had to do a lot of more work. This summer, I went out and I did some more research, gather information, and I'm going to show you a few more things as we go. We were listening also to some interesting material that I gathered over the summer. Now, we'll only start for people joining us now. What is interesting about this is, as I said earlier on, we're all food and language experts, aren't we? When you ask people, if you ever taught language, you will see people say, That word means, they say, what is pranzo? And people say, oh, it's lunchtime. And when I say, what about pranzo in the evening? No, it can't be. I say, look up the dictionary. And then people are surprised to see that there's only one. There isn't just one meaning. Okay, so there is an idea that we own a language. And the same happens to food. We own meals because, we remember them from the old days and, when everything was perfect out, and everything was very good and tasty. Now, so I keep thinking often about, I mentioned it to my colleagues, native foodism and native speakerism. Basically, you're born with that thing, and but I keep reminding people that word culture isn't about an object of worship. If you don't cultivate a tree, you won't get very much, do you? Well, you may get some of the odd fruit, but you need to look after something. So it's about, constant work, hence the Latin colere, to cultivate. So it's not something we inherit, except that people define culture as something which is up there and is used often in non-scientific ways to mean anything and nothing at the same time. In other words, it's the culture. It's a bit like saying, okay, fingers crossed because something may go wrong, instead of saying, fix the problem. Imagine an engineer saying, well, look, it's in the culture of the airplane if it crashes. It wouldn't happen to an engineer, a doctor wouldn't do that, but referring to food and languages, it's often the case. Okay. Now, the problem is that speaking and cooking doesn't make you a historian. And the more you actually dig into things, the more you realize that you are very ignorant. Of course, there are people born with a culture, we know that, they know everything. But the reality is a bit more complex. Now, we should be more humble, I think, and less dogmatic. Food is seen as dogma by a lot of people. And then you got state interference. You got label the food, and who cares? With a flag, and you think, oh, it's tastier because the food's got a flag. I doubt. If you're happy with that, that's your problem. Okay. But when you study cultural expressions, you need the evidence. As much as you need the evidence when you are doing an experiment in a laboratory, you need the evidence. And without the evidence, you can't say, oh, this is the way it is because I heard it is this way. Are you with me? So this is the way you do basically, scientific research. Not because somebody told you to do so, but I'm ignorant. I like to find out more, and you keep digging. And the more you dig, the more you realize that you are ignorant. Okay, that's the way it works, the system. Now, obviously, you can say, okay, authenticity in food. What's authentic? The word authentic, by the way, means apparently the first meaning is made by itself, which means nothing. But we know the legal meaning is something which, it's either this or that, more or less. Okay? So it's a legal way of defining things. So labeling food and languages with a flag is a political statement, after all. Except that you go on TripAdvisor and you say, the restaurant serves French food, and God knows what it means. It serves Italian food, British food, and nobody understands exactly what it is, except that label makes everybody happy. Unfortunately, as a researcher, I can't accept it. I don't criticize people for putting labels, but I keep thinking, what does it actually mean? Is it good or bad, first of all? Okay, what does it contain? What does it make it so British, American, Italian, and Japanese? We don't know. Okay, so our state does not own recipes or languages, except now with gastronationalism. There's a book that came out a couple of years ago. It's called Gastronazionalismo. I'm not sure when it has been published in English, but it's about the fact that these days, particularly at the moment, we tend to, in France and Italy, for example, they created a ministry, for basically defending food in many ways. Okay, so think about it. So that's what they're doing. Now, the other problem though is that although you may put a flag and a border, we know that languages, I can speak Italian, parliamo in italiano, so there is no border, you can see, okay? And also, languages are spoken by individuals. Often we say, ex-speaking countries. No, it's ex-speaking people, I keep saying, because countries don't move usually. Well, during earthquakes, I suppose, but they don't really move, You may move the borders. Now, so the fact that we don't have any borders, it means that also food hasn't got any borders in itself. It can travel anywhere. So just saying, this kind of food has a border, it's a bit difficult to accept because, it's easier to say because it's a very quick answer, but if you look at it carefully, it doesn't really work. Okay? So the proof is when you go out and eat, you can eat anything, basically. Well, more or less, according to your wallet and your needs. Now, geography, in fact, and trade, I say geography, I should say orography as well, but geography in general, it could be the sea and the mountain passes, for example, because the sea is, you've got the ports, the goods go through the ports, and we'll see later on, this is an important factor in shaping food cultures. And then you've got also mountain passes, because if you had to go through a mountain pass, you had to pay somebody to do the job, okay? Or you had to pay your duties and so forth, and customs and so forth. So, I think it's more important, the way I see it, that geography and trade contribute to shaping food cultures more than ideology. Now, I'm taking you to, after the aperitivo, should we say, yeah, when there was no drinks at all, I should take you now to the main course here to start. And instead of thinking in national labels, I prefer to use expressions such as mountain and later on sea cultures. And I'll explain you why in a minute. We are looking now at Switzerland's Ticino and Italian Grisons. Now there are two cantons out of, of Switzerland, basically. So Switzerland is formed by cantons rather than regions. Okay? And what is interesting that both of these cantons are in a mountain region. So very few areas can actually have, flat plains, for example, just around Locarno, it's a small area. So very few areas, and the same happens to the Grisons, only a small section here. The rest are just basically mountainous, okay? And the mountainous terrain obviously affects, the food production, but also consumption in many ways, because if you think about the climate, obviously, if you're in the middle of summer in a very hot place, I'm sure you don't have certain food because you're saying, I'm saying it's too heavy. But if you're actually in a cold place, the climate affects the way you eat because you need, more calories, so to speak. Now, this is the Grisons. That map is not great, but you can see it's mainly three areas, 4 valleys, not far away from the Ticino, but it's divided, all together, Ticino contiguous here. And today we're looking mainly at the Bregaglia, and I'll tell you why later on, okay, from this point of view. Now, what is interesting about the Grisons and the Ticino is that they have a completely different history until basically become part of Switzerland. Now, I'll show you the map in a minute. This is fundamental to understand how food cultures are shaped as well. You will see in a minute why. Now, there was, have you heard of the city of Buon, possibly? Had a bishop, and obviously, it's still today the largest diocese in Switzerland, Catholic diocese. But you heard of the Reformation as well. Well now, in 1524, an ensemble of differing leagues, okay, 3 leagues in particular, decided to more or less form a state. And then, as they formed, actually just a few years before this, there was a lot of turmoil. I don't want to actually give you too many details here. Obviously, there were lots of invasions. You may have heard of Leonardo da Vinci moved from Milan, went to France, and so forth. Okay, so the state of Milan was in turmoil, there were a lot of invasions, so everybody tried to actually get hold of more land if they could, particularly if you need to feed your people. Why? Because if you actually live in a mountainous canton, you need the food. And where do you get it from? Well, if you've got a fertile area, you want it. Okay, that's exactly what happened. So, a part of what is now Italy, the Valtellina, Valtellina, Valchiarenna, and Bormio, in a couple of years' time, actually, you will hear about Bormio because of the Winter Olympics. Anyway, that area became part, but it was actually not a free state. It was part of the 3 leagues. The irony is the 3 leagues were much smaller in terms of population and much poorer in those days. Okay, so that's an interesting factor here. Now, why is this important here? I said there were no kings, emperors, or princes. Now, we know the Reformation, the princes, who happened to be the bishops as well, lost their power here. And that's important because the princes became the municipalities, the communes. Okay? So every municipality was more or less a little republic. And then freely associated within, a larger picture. Are you with me? Which is not really easy to understand in a country like England, when you got a king, or in France even, when you got everything centralized. Does it make any sense a little bit? Okay, picture. Now, what has it got to do with the food? Obviously, the fact that these areas share a a historical period in terms of unity for 300 years. You can see here, if this part was still part of Switzerland, that would be the bit at the bottom here. So this is not a map of real Switzerland. It's Switzerland plus the areas which are now part of Italy. Okay? If the food is important here because without the food, obviously, everything collapses. So apples, wine particularly. Note, I'm going to show you this. Okay, I'm not going to drink it, I'm afraid. Okay, but this is a friend of mine who makes wine in the Valteland, but they come from the Grisons. And a third of the production is still today in the hands of people from Switzerland because of this historical connection. Now, that lasted from 1512 until 1797. Then Napoleon came, and then despite that, 50% of the marriages, particularly in Val Poschiavo, are between people from the Valteland and people from the Val Poschiavo, to show you how strongly connected they are. Okay? And yet, despite the fact that the ideology of unified Italy has crept up and more or less tried to control everything here. Okay? So we're actually in a situation which is quite interesting. And on top of that, you need to bear in mind that this area was also affected by the Reformation, except that eventually, the people were massacred, and little was left of this Protestantism here in the Valley. But in the Grisons, you have the free choice to choose between to be Catholic or Protestant. And we'll see this why it's so important in later on. Keep you waiting for this. Now, Ticino is different instead. Ticino was a bailiwick, so basically a bailiwick is a subject country. And it was so until the 19th century, when then it became part of Switzerland as we now know it. But that has actually shaped, molded the mentality of the Ticinese, very different from the Grisonese. The Grisonese, we're free. We've been free for 600 years, more. Free from the Milanese, free from the Austrian emperor, you name it. Are you with me? Completely free. Here said, we always have a problem with burn, So this is exactly the mentality. So you have to look at it this way. And then we have a problematic neighbor. The problematic neighbor is Italy. Which is why I said, okay, so they are political Swiss, they speak the Italian language. What about the food? Wait for it. But Ticino has a very schizophrenic relation to its Italianness. Why? Because they want to say, no, we are Swiss, but we speak Italian. Okay, in a way, because they don't want to be associated to the idea of Italian vices, as Silvana Patriarca referred to this concept. Italianità equals Italian vices. Okay, that's the title of the original book it came out in America, and in Italian it was translated as Italianità. Okay, it's a very good book in fact to read. It's not a book by a journalist, it's a scholarly work, very well written about this. Now, the fact that they have this schizophrenic relationship to the Italianness makes it Ticino a very interesting case study for many things, including for its own Ticinesità, the essence, the way they see their own food cultures as well. Okay, and it's fascinating. But now, what about the food? Well, if you went to Ticino, you will see that the food is quite similar to that of the neighboring regions of northern Italy, particularly. Except we can't talk about regional cuisine again, because region has a political meaning. Well, at least in Italian, because regioni, they only were introduced in 1970 in Italy. So when you talk about regional, what do you mean? How big is the region? How small? You see, you can't define things until you have a flag, more or less. And even then, you notice that it doesn't work, because Lombardy in particular, there's nothing regional at all about the food, because the food of the Valteland is very similar to that of the Grisons in Switzerland, but very different than the south. To the point that even a supermarket chain, okay, I can name it, Iberal. Now, they're more or less everywhere in Lombardy, but in the northern part of Lombardy, and you won't find them south of Milan. And they tend to sell you this kind of food, mainly, and they're very successful. So that just shows you exactly how regional you could be, to the point that you don't go below the hills very much. Okay. So one interesting, if you want, thing in common is the culture of the grotti and grotti. What are these places? Well, I could potentially show it to you, but I want to bore you to death. Now, the grotti and grotti, people say, yes, they're caves. Well, no. And dictionaries translate it as osteria. No, I'm afraid, sorry. I'm sorry, mate, it's not an osteria, because an osteria typically was a place where you drink. Now they have become posh places as well where you eat. The grotti were a natural case where you store the food because of the phenomenon, the geological phenomenon, where you get cold air which comes out of the mountain, and the temperature is constant throughout summer and winter, about 7 or 8 degrees. So the grotti were the place where you store your sausages, where or if you want, your charcuterie, and your cheese, and your wine. And then they became a place where people ate that thing. Are you with me? So where you call it grotti and crop, and they are typically found in Ticino and in some parts of Alpine Lombardy. Okay? So, call it regional? No. Once again, because how big is the region? Okay? So this is the problem. Of course, there are examples of these grotti or grotti elsewhere as storage places as far as the south of Italy, but not in the sense we have here, where now they have become a social place where you go and eat, and some of them don't even have a proper kitchen, or now they have actually modernized, okay, and they tend to just serve you cold food. Yeah? Does that make any sense a little bit? So, we got this thing in common. There's another problem here. If we start applying the label Italian to Switzerland in particular, for the Adriatic, the situation is even more complicated and complex. We risk having a problem which was known as irredentismo. Now, irredentismo means that you think that land belongs to you. Why? Because they created the myth of the natural border of the Alps. So anything south of the border must be Italian. That's what they actually teach, in geography atlases. We have to be cautious with this because there are no natural borders, as you well see. Birds fly across borders, don't they? So natural, what does it mean? You can swim through it, So we have to be very cautious with this kind of thing. So in the name of that, they created this idea Italy should be anything south of the Alps, which created problems, wars as well. Italy entered the First World War on that basis. Okay? So we need to bear in mind this problem. Now, irredentismo affected Ticino briefly. There was a good reason for that. There was some Italian, as usual, let me call them expats here, because they were really political. Often they were politicized people who went everywhere, caused problems. Imagine Mussolini, he did the same thing when he went to, overseas. He was also a troublemaker. But that was before him. And the fact that these people thought, okay, Ticino should be Italian because they officially have Italian as a language. So, okay, are you with me? And they went beyond that because during fascism they thought that Italy should comprise most of eastern Switzerland as well. Okay? So this is actually, you need to put yourself in this situation where you think, okay, your neighbor can actually invade you. Okay? So to understand why for a lot of time there was a lot of tension between Italy and Switzerland, although a lot of people don't talk about this, but you never know with a neighbor like that, you have to be cautious. Defend yourself. Of course, you have your northern neighbors and western neighbors as well you have to worry about. Now, but the interesting thing, the Grisons were never politically interested in becoming part of an Italian nation state. Never, because they were free. Well, if you can govern your own taxes locally, why would you join a central state which takes away your taxes and tells you what to do? Would you be interested? It's like getting married. You're forced to get married because that woman, that man, comes from the same, originally, you think, comes from the same place. That's a forced marriage, isn't it? Okay, so here, they were interested. In fact, in 1918, in the Grisons, the Italian Grisons, they founded an association called Progresso Italiano, which was to promote the Italianness of the canton, but against Italian claims. So that was interesting. So basically, an autochthonous Italianness, if you want, which is opposed to the Italian one from Italy. Okay? It may sound a bit crazy, but that's the way it works. Yeah. Okay? Va bene? Now, let's go to the food, and we'll enter the food sphere more on. So, referring to a cuisine as being Italian without inverted commas, just because you share a language and you call a food pizzocchero and it sounds Italian to you, I think it's like an actual cultural parasite, because you are putting a label on that this is actually mine. So you won't accept that things are not that straightforward. So the fact that you have a name and a language, the food is that, comes from there. We know it's not true. Okay? Now, What is interesting, though, we think about the Italian influxes overseas, don't we? You know, the food goes everywhere. But we don't think about what happens, that the influences come from outside what is now Italy. The difficult case of Venice is interesting. Think about coffee. Coffee came into England very late. We know it's the first coffee shop opened in Oxford in 1651. But a few decades earlier, Venice was already booming, you know, in terms of it. And, you know, from the coffee shops were more or less everywhere. And obviously it was even more so in the following centuries. Okay. Now, the interesting thing, though, that most of the cafes in Venice were run by people from the Grisons, a lot of the Protestants. But in 1767, Venetians decided that you know, they were no longer that tolerant. So, you know, they just told the Grisonese, you no longer want it. Bear in mind that the mercenaries working for the Venetians didn't have their own army or navy. You know, this is a bit of a myth. So what they employed, of course, the Venetians when they had to go to war, but they also had mercenaries, and the Grisons were a good group of people as well for that. But the most important thing is the food. So these people were expelled, and where did they go? They went to Trieste because of the tolerance agreed by the monarchy, you know, in Vienna. And they established themselves there, and in fact, at the beginning of the 19th century, I think it's 80%, if I remember very well, of all the coffee shops in Trieste were in the hands of these Grisonese. Still today, you can still find a street called Androna dei Grigioni, because they had their own church. In fact, the oldest church in Trieste was actually a Protestant church. You know, well, now it's no longer a church, I think. But the interesting thing is people say, oh, Vienna and Trieste, including the Triestines themselves, but they forget that the reality is a bit more different. Because where does the coffee come from? Well, how did it get there? Do you think it's actually on mules? No, you take used ships. And that makes sense now, the port of Trieste, the boom, you know, following the end of Venice in 1797. So not from Vienna, the coffee. Again, it's a big myth, that one. Although it's a myth that people love. Okay? But this was a massive influence. Not only that, but the Grisonese established lots of coffee shops in Rome and Sicily. In fact, the most important coffee shops, patisseries, in fact, in Sicily, are still, I think a couple of them are still running, from the Grisons, Caflish and so forth. Okay, so that's an important thing to bear in mind. So, now, what is interesting, and I'll get to the bottom here, is that the money made by these mainly Protestant emigres, they decided to reinvest them back in their own homeland. So Valposchiavo and Bregaglia, for example. Now, this was not built without money, by the way. It was built before that. But when you went to, if you went to Bregaglia, which is, you know, an incredible valley in Switzerland, by the way, great connection with England. If you want, I'll tell you after during this discussion about this. Now, you will find some interesting architecture next to, you know, you find rural buildings. Then you suddenly find these incredible palazzos, and you think, how on earth can it be here? Because if you travel around the Alps, you don't get anything like this anywhere else. You find, you know, normal villages, or then you find places with, you know, with winter facilities that look all the same. Not the case here. And you find these incredible palazzos, and again, another palazzo which it wasn't, okay, literally built, money coming from the patisseries at least, but this interesting building, which is in castegn, 100 meters from the Italian border, was built by an architect which you may have heard because you've been to Dresden in Germany. Have you been to Semper Oper? The opera house was built by Gottfried Semper. Now, this is the only building he actually designed south of the Alps. And it's a building which advocates what? It tried to evoke Rome, because his friend Schinkel was operating in Berlin, in Potsdam. He built lots of these things, and everything has to go back to ancient Rome. Now, this is an interesting thing. You can see the vine and everything. You know, you have to look at possibly from the inside as well to appreciate it. Now, so a mountain village with stunning architecture, mountain villages, I should say, and a lot of the money came through trade. The fact they went to, you know, they work in, they had their own coffee shops, including in England, particularly in, I'm thinking about Devon, Ilfracombe is one of them, okay? But not just that, everywhere, basically. And they made the money in Spain as well, and with the money they made, generation after generation, they put the money back into these valleys, you know, because they refer to that as homelands, okay? Even after many, many many generations. Now, but Swiss Bregaglia is very close to Italy. In fact, we've got Italian Bregaglia as well. Okay? Once part of the same state, but the Italian Bregaglia, now maybe at least nominally Catholic. The Swiss Bregaglia instead, nominally, things have changed recently, but nominally Protestant. At least it used to be Reformed, so to speak, as they say locally. Now, this was in 2011. You can see there was a gate, and then look what happened. Obviously, it was changed in 2014. In a period where borders go up here, after centuries of, Protestant versus Catholic, this, imagine in England, think about the 5th of November, people still, evoke that kind of, hostility towards Catholicism here, don't they? Okay. Now, the interesting thing, the two sides of the valleys have suddenly started working together beautifully in many ways, in many different projects. But from the food side, things are slightly different. Okay, so this is the pedestrian border, this is crossing, this is actually the street. Villa Garibaldi is just up there here. Okay? Now, but what you notice at this church, can you see it, or is it not dark enough here? Do you notice any paintings here? So when you see the building from the outside, it looks like any Italian church. Well, we're in Switzerland here. So it was built in the same style as you will see many churches, but there are no paintings. And unlike Italian churches, where everything is written in Latin here, you've got things written in Italian. So the Italian language is right here, mainly because of the Protestant people who had to leave what is now Italy, particularly from Lucca and Tuscany. And they started using it here. Look at this. This is bisogna obbedire a Dio anziché agli uomini. That's the first thing you notice straight away. Basically, ignore the rules. You only have to follow God. That says it all about their culture already here. Okay? So, they're not interested in taking orders. And they're not anarchists, by the way. But, what has it got to do with this? When you imagine Italian culture, you imagine everything to do with paintings, no words. As you know, the Bible was forbidden by the Catholic Church between 1563 and 1963, so you couldn't read it. In turn, that turned a lot of the population, most of the population was ignorant in many ways, so only paintings. Which is why in Italy, the sense of the exterior, a sense of even clothing, was extremely strong. Because looking inward, you couldn't do that, because you couldn't read. Here, we have a completely different kind of culture, because it's shaped by Protestantism in many ways. Okay, so that has contributes a lot to distinguishing these people from these valleys. Okay, although the neighbouring valleys, okay, with a common history, but very different mentalities because of this. Okay, one is part of a centralised state, nominally Catholic, with all its negative and positive aspects, which you may have seen when you travel. The other is actually, everything is centered on the word and not on the exterior. But when it comes to food, what is surprising about Bregaglia, you get there and you find in a shop like this, a small shop, there aren't many supermarkets. So a small shop, Swiss-German food cultures as well as local ones. So you find, pancake strips. Yeah, unfortunately, the quality is not great with this, and as well as local molino, which is Scartazzini. Interesting enough, the Scartazzini family included one of the most important Dante experts in the world, Gianandrea Scartazzini. So there you are, Italian language, but you don't need to be like the others. Are you with me? Okay. So the fact you have a language in common doesn't mean you are identical. Okay. Differences in Protestantism, but also in food cultures, because they tend to also include in their own food, if you want, produce, if you want, final products coming from north of the Alps, so Swiss-German as well. Okay. Of course, they're very proud of Roman production, by the way, and particularly this time of the year, with chestnuts. Okay. Now, look at this, and this is where it gets even more interesting. And this is where dictionaries also fail. Now, there are peculiar festivities and food practices. Now, I had to dig a lot this summer, and I found out about this thing. Now, it may not look very appealing to vegetarians, but this is actually called castegn da calendamärz. And you would think, what on earth is it? Now, castagna, chestnuts, fine. So, because in these areas, particularly, I was reading that Pusi, that's in a lot of places in Italy in his day, not many people use chestnuts. This is interesting. chestnut flour. Anyway, in these areas, and more than bread and anything else, chestnuts were the essential food. So the staple food was chestnut, anything to do with chestnuts, otherwise you would die. Okay, and what the Romans apparently introduced, these trees apparently, and in castegn, there you are, the name. Castegn has the largest chestnut grove in Europe, and people flock there for this particular reason. So it's like a cult in a way. But what is interesting is, apart from you've got pancetta, cubes, pepper, and as well chestnuts and whipped cream on top, this interesting speciality is only eaten on the 1st of March. But interesting, on the other side of the Bregaglia, everybody's denied that the speciality existed. By the way, I asked a restaurant which is only 200 meters from the border. Okay. Eventually, I got to a waitress who said to me, "Yes, but my grandmother used to make this as well. We occasionally make it in the family." The slow food movement had no idea what they were talking about. Never heard. But interestingly, in some parts of the Val Chiavenna and Valtellina, some families had the speciality, but it's not associated with the 1st of March. But then again, why the 1st of March? Now, calendamärz, if you look up the Treccani dictionary, it refers to the 1st of day of March, which calends in the Roman world was the first day of the month, when the order of the days was proclaimed and an accounts were due. Okay? And in the Roman pre-Julian calendar, March was the first month. What has it got to do with this? Interesting enough, in the Italian valleys nearby, they celebrate the spring part of calendamärz, but not with the food, by the way. But so they go out with bells and ring and so forth. Okay, so similar to what they do in parts of Switzerland. But the fact that dictionaries don't even record this, in Italy, for example, says it all, that alpine cultures are neglected. Ignoring it is a big thing, it's not even acknowledging that it exists. And it's a big affair, the calendamärz party, all across the Grisons. So my conclusion to this is that, can we talk about a Grecian alpine culture? Yes, but with caveats. But we can't talk about an Italian or even a Swiss, pan-Swiss culture in terms of food. Are you with me? Because everything is very localized. And these festivities, I don't know why they disappeared elsewhere. But the fact that they were retained in the nearby Valtellina and Val Chiavenna says that possibly the fact that the two areas shared 300 years of history may have influenced this. Okay? So on the outer, if you want, on the edges of the Roman, I should say, the Catholic world, these things resisted and still there. Now, before we actually take a break, I suppose, are there Italian food cultures? Without hesitation, say not without inverted commas. I'd stay away from that because, as I said, you just label things just for the sake of labeling things. Okay, and then what does Italian culture mean? Now, similar mountain cultures on either side of the border, but not many points of contact with the rest of Italy. This is interesting, even to this day. And this is why, for example, if you try to find pizzoccheri as a food in England, in Italian restaurants, I'm sure that you will not find them more or less anywhere except in the rare place where they may actually serve it to you. Because even the idea of eating that food, for some people, I don't say it is revolting, but it isn't revolting, but it does not come to your mind because it's not a Mediterranean idea. And anything to do with Italian is associated with the idea of the Mediterranean and not the Alps. This is the conclusion I come to. So anything to do with the Alps is, no, it cannot be Italian. It's a bit crazy, but again, and it doesn't come from the outside, it's actually inside as well, the mindset in Italy. The Alps are, a very strange place to go skiing, to eat the food, but when it comes to Italianness, it's only to defend the borders. Okay? The rest are completely ignored, and these cultures are ignored in many ways. Now, of course, the main factor, though, dividing why we can't use the word Italian is the political cultures, completely different political cultures, from taxation to the military, to the military, to anything, basically, except that they share a language, at least officially. Okay, Fabien? Shall we take a break or shall I carry on?
Carry on.
Are you sure? Oh dear, you're not bored. Any dozing off? Okay, the sun is out as well, so you may.
Now, we move on a little bit. You may say, yes, why are these areas connected? Well, historically they were. Historically, because you've got the Venetian Republic, which bordered with the Grisons. The Venetian Republic is gone, so we no longer have that, common world or shared areas, okay, of trade, where you got, the goods coming from Venice going to Northern Europe, as well as people who actually have to leave because of, religious and political reasons. They could easily flee to the Grisons, and be welcome. A lot of these people who left, in fact, from Istria, which is present-day Slovenia and Croatia, one of the most famous bishops, in fact, there were two brothers, one bishop in Capodistria, another in Pula, they had to leave, not to be burned. And they became preachers in Bregaglia and Poschiavo. Interesting. Then they were off to Tübingen and other places, they met Luther. So you got the kind of, so there was a historical connection also at a religious level, which in those days were very, very important. Okay. Final thing before we move on to Istria, places like Poschiavo became very important because they could print any books which were banned elsewhere. So it became an interesting place, a meeting place to develop ideas, free from the Pope, bishops, and princes who didn't like, certain publications because, you had to control your people. Okay, so in many ways, a lot of people made money through selling, and as I mentioned in January, through publishing forbidden books. Okay, but that's a story for another time, I suppose. Now, we move on to Istria, as I mentioned, Virgilio, who is Paolo Virgilio, the younger, who was a bishop of Capodistria. And the interesting thing, should you go there, at Capodistria, you will find a statue in a square called Piazza Verdi, or Verditor. And he said, why is it there? Not because they want to remember the Protestant bit, but because he was very influential, and he, one of his disciples, in inverted commas, is considered the father of the Slovenian language. So, okay. And in Slovenia, they celebrate the Day of Reformation on 31st of October, which is not far away, as a national day. But Slovenia is namely, at least nominally, we should say, apologize, a Catholic country. Okay, do you see these things? Nationalism, language. Yeah, okay. Now, but the interesting thing about these areas isn't much the historical connection between these areas and the Grisons. In fact, we can see here, this is where the Grisons are. Venice was the main power. Venice, as you know, for hundreds of years was the wealthiest city in Europe. Okay, possibly one of the wealthiest cities in the world. That's why you can see it. So, well, at least the past wealth. And Venice didn't have an empire, except that you read the Venetian Empire, where there was no emperor. Use your words correctly. There was no emperor. It was a republic. They didn't have a professional army or navy. When they had to go to war, there was a good reason for them. Make sure that trade continued. They're not interested in conquering places. In fact, a lot of these places wanted the protection of Venice, and they were actually, Kotor today, was denied this protection 6 times. But Venice did lots of business with the Turks. The first copy of the Quran, as far as I know, the first printed copy was printed in Venice. So Venice was an interesting place to meet people, a bit like London today or New York in many ways, okay? Everybody went there, so you got a Protestant, you got the Jews, you got anything. But the interesting thing is, these areas, of course, were important for Venice because, the coast was safe, well, at least they could use it safely, right? Because lots of, sheltered, lots of islands. On this side of the coast, it was a bit difficult to actually deal with the neighbours, okay? So it was actually there was a logic behind. Okay, so this was more or less an area controlled by Venice, at least by its ships. But the interesting thing, as I mentioned, the ships, is because the sea is what, like the mountains earlier on, shape the food cultures. Why? Because everything moves from one ship to the next. When you have no roads, no railways, well, things have not changed very much. There are roads there now. Railways are not so good, I should say. So the ports are very important. I apologize for the pun. But then you got the goods. You come from the east, and the cities tend to actually the places where things mingle. That's why you create things, and you create constantly. Now,
Today, in this area, we have three countries mainly. We got Slovenia, so what was used to be part of different empires. You got first of all, you got Austria, and then you got the Venetian Republic, and then you got the Ottoman Empire, and you name it. So, but today we got Slovenia, Croatia, and Montenegro, very different countries, although it used to be part of Yugoslavia. And in these areas these are called indigenous, autochthonous, whatever you want to do, Italian national communities. Now, these are not communities of people who moved from Italy, by the way. Okay. They're as much as they're as Italians the Italians in Italy. In what sense? In the sense that, I met people who live in the same house, where the same family basically lived in that house for hundreds of years, and the house changed country, but they never moved. Okay? Doesn't make any sense a little bit. So you have to consider it in a different perspective from people who moved overseas, expats or immigrants and so forth, whatever you want to call them. Okay? And there are today about 51 communities plus the one in Montenegro. Okay? So they organize, they do a lot of things, and one of the things they really cherish a lot is food. Okay? We'll see that some interesting bits here. Now, one of the interesting things is a meal. I won't go much into the details of the food yet, but meals. Have you heard of merenda or marenda? Anybody?
Yes.
What do you associate merenda with usually?
Snack. Breakfast. Snack.
You say breakfast, you say snack. Okay, you can see the meals. When you name a meal, unless you got a law telling you that meal must be X, Y, Z, can be in the morning, in the afternoon, could be a snack, and so forth. Except merenda, at least in Italy, and also in Switzerland, I should say, has become associated with the afternoon snack, especially, but not limited, to children. Okay, so it could be a sweet snack, it could be an apple, anything. Okay, but this is not the case, though, in Istria and Dalmatia. In the Boka Kotorska, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Okay, so keep both. Now, my question is, though, is it merenda or marenda, which is now the current spelling in Croatia, particularly, is marenda. I can call you close to one of the windows.
It's okay, I'm fine.
Okay. Now, it has become now a Croatian institution, at least in the sense that everybody going to these areas had merenda. But look at this. I'm not telling you, because I prefer to actually ask another person. You may have heard of Lidia Bastianic, who's a critically acclaimed chef who was born in Istria, moved to New York City when she was 12, and she created a huge, I don't like the word empire, a food empire. She's acknowledged as one of the leading chefs in the world. In fact, her son Joe Bastianic was the judge on the Italian MasterChef. Okay. So, she has more than, I think, 1 million followers, on the YouTube and so forth, on social media. And this is what she's got to say about merenda.
Yes, I remember merenda when I was young. My grandparents used to practice this, certainly. And that meant that getting up early, 5, 6 o'clock, to go in the field and to do their work while the sun was still low and cool. Breakfast was not a big deal. Coffee, caffè latte con pane, or the polenta left over with some milk, very light. But at 10 o'clock there was the merenda. And the merenda was a pretty serious deal. Nourishment, proteins, prosciutto, frittate, certainly frittate of prosciutto, frittate of asparagus, cheese, salami, all those kind of nice piece of bread, and also a glass of wine. Lunch was a little later. Working, lunch was about 1:32, and lunch was the big meal of the day. And that meant a cooked meal, homemade pasta, some proteins, whether it was chicken, whether it was rabbit, lots of vegetables, pasta, certainly gnocchi, fusi, whatever. When it got colder, minestra with sausages in there. And of course, dinner was much lighter in the evening, around 7 o'clock, 6, 7 o'clock, and it was usually a salad with maybe a boiled egg, maybe some cooked beans. So merenda was important, and it was a big sort of break between the hard work of the early morning and leading into lunch. After lunch, you know, it was hard to get back into the fields, so most of it in the morning.
Right, what is interesting, what Lydia said, is that this was originally a meal for people basically working hard. Today, it has become a meal for tourists. And it's everywhere. How does it actually spread from one area to the next? That's the question. Well, we're part of the same state. Not really. It spread before that. It was through the port, which is why it was associated with the ports. Okay, not the port and drinks, by the way. Okay, so the port, as in Pola, as it used to be known until 1947, and you've got Fiume or now Rijeka, and you just move down along the Dalmatian coast. So, is it Croatian or Italian? This is the question. Okay, I prefer to call it sea cultures because labeling things with a flag, you're actually starting a war again. I mean, it's useless, and it's very dangerous also. Except when you look up online, you find everywhere flags, and you say, "This is our type of thing." Okay. Anyway, everybody's free to choose whatever they want.
Merenda.
Oh, sorry, I apologize. Now. No more merenda. It was actually, and if you went to, and I was in literature, you see the merenda served in places like Istria today. You know, it's where everybody goes there, irrespective of whether they call themselves Albanians, Italians, Serbs, and they, wherever they come from in terms of religious background, because it's a good place to eat. It's a good excuse to have something to eat. Okay, so, but in Italy, I tried every single historical dictionary, and there is no evidence very much that it was actually associated with a morning meal. So, peculiarities of these areas, which is why it is interesting for me to explore, because it gives you a different dimension to meals in many ways. But another interesting thing, then you actually talk about specialities. What is a speciality? Well, for me, a speciality is something that exists in a place and in another place is almost unknown. And this is the case of the ombolo. Now, the first time I ended up eating ombolo, it was actually it was a disaster for me that day, because I said, no, I'm not interested in fish. And out of my ignorance, sheer ignorance, I saw the face of the waitress, and she looked at me and said, "Where do you come from?" She didn't say that, but I think she meant it. And no, it could be different things, very different things. But certainly it is associated with winter and also with Easter. On Easter Day, what I found out. I was there in winter, that's why I actually showed me this. And it could be A, B, or C. It could be, so if it's grilled, usually it's younger, and if it's it's mature, you go for this. And to show you what it looks like, let me see if it opens correctly. Oops. Can you see here? Ombolo. Everything else written in Croatian, you can see about ombolo. Okay, so it's proud. Istrians want to consider themselves very different from the rest of Croatia, particularly the Croatian side. And politically they are very different, because it's the only region that welcomes the diversity, in fact, officially. Okay? And this has been going on since 1992, like this. Okay. So, and one of their main, well, if you want, product, you've got also truffles, you name it, but ombolo certainly is something they really love. Although today, as you know, because of diets, there's a risk that ombolo doesn't disappear because the Italian community is dying. By the way, ombolo is shared by everybody, but because of diets, so it could be that ombolo may disappear because people say, enough of meat and enough of these, fatty food. But also, in a book which I analysed, it was a collection of 14 short stories by Roberta Dubas, you've got an image of how food changed in the 20th and the 21st centuries, where in the 1930s the food of these areas were very similar, much more similar to the food found in the Friuli region, which is why some historians think that a lot of the food in Istria today came from the region in what is now northern Friuli, Carnia and so forth. This is what they think. Okay, but then you've got, the exodus of the Italians after the Second World War for political and economic reasons. We're talking about an exodus in 7 years where up to 90% of the population left. So new people come in and they bring in new food. Cevapcici, have you tasted cevapcici?
Yes.
Now cevapcici, sorry, I apologize for this. Now you can see here, now you can associate with Ivar. Again, Ivar associated with, in general, with the Balkans, but also beyond that. Now, I'm saying this because in one of the stories told by Dubac, you've got this husband and wife, and the wife cooks the ombolo, and husband is cevapcici, a cevapcici fan. So you got, some people say cultures meeting, but do they mix? No, because you don't mix the two foods together, do you? So mixing is a word which I find a bit bizarre. You know, it's like those people mixing races. What does it mean? We have one race at the end of the world. So at the end of the day. So this is exactly what I think is a bit bizarre. They are separate dishes, except that they enrich, if you want, the offer you've got in these areas, as opposed to mix them. You don't mix them. Well, you can, I suppose, but I'm sure you don't want to mix coffee and tea. Do you? You can, and so I'm sure some people do so. Okay, so now the question though is it ombolo regional? It is in this case, because it's associated now almost exclusively with this area in many ways, particularly the Croatian bit of Istria. Okay, because now since 1992 you've got a small bit of Istria is found in Slovenia and only a couple of villages in Italy. But when we mean Istria these days, most people think it's Croatia, okay, although it's technically not correct. Now, but we travel down further to Dalmatia, we're nearly there by the way, and we are in a place called, in Italian, Zara, like the shop, and in Croatian, Zadar. I personally call it Zanzara because of the amount of mosquitoes there. So I think the etymology should be that one. But anyway, no, I'm not telling you not to go because of the mosquitoes. But the interesting thing, people coming from England about Zara or Zadar, is that the bell tower, the most important bell tower of the city, was built by an Englishman. What? Yes, because the Venetians said, we do want to complete this. They left it unfinished 500 years ago because the bell tower shouldn't compete with that of Venice. And Sir Thomas Graham Jackson, who built a lot of things in Oxford, the Bridge of Sighs, the school, examination schools and so forth. Have you been there, I suppose, to Oxford? Okay. And he wrote incredible books about his journeys down here. He was actually, I think, the best ethnographer in those areas, in his books, amazing books. And he designed the bell tower, and everybody's proud of this bell tower. But that's one side of Zara. The rest of the city was emptied, towards the end of the Second World War. And some with it also went a famous, its most famous food product, I should call it, because drinks are part of food, as far as I'm concerned. And have you heard of maraschino? Okay, you've got these special cherries, which were still very widespread in Dalmatia, and there are debates whether maraschino was invented by the monks. We had to be very careful here because with drinks, myths about. What we know that at the end of the 18th century, industrial production started. Then eventually there were a couple of big firms, and the main firm which stayed there was, the next one here, is Luxardo. Luxardo was a Genoese family, and they moved to Zara a long time ago. And this is actually significant. Can you see the sign here? Zara 1821, and it says original. And that says here, also since 1821, who's right, who's wrong. The story is that when the city of Zara or Zadar was emptied of its population, overpopulation by the way, then it was taken over by Yugoslavia, and the factory, the Luxardo factory was basically, shall we say, expropriated. It's the right term, but we had to be careful because obviously Yugoslavia was a socialist country, and the concept of the law, I'm looking at some special people who know about law, expropriation in a socialist state, is a different thing. You just take it and you basically do whatever you want with it. You don't have to pay any compensation. Anyway, the Luxardo family left because they were they were associated, all the Italians there were associated with fascism. Some of the members were sentenced to death with their families. Some managed to escape and went to Italy.
And they founded the company again in 1947, that's in Torreglia, near Padua, where even the cherry, their maraschino cherries actually grow. So they no longer import anything from Dalmatia. But they say, what has it got to do with us? What I discovered recently is Malaska, which now became part of a company whose owners are from Bosnia, so you can't make this up. It's interesting. They occupied the factory of the Luxardo, and you could see until a few years ago it says Maraska, the name of the company, which was the socialist company founded by Yugoslavia. But then, obviously, they had to move to new premises. The building was a beautiful building, by the way, and it was turned into a posh hotel this year, that one. But the interesting thing, 3 years ago, the Croatian Prime Minister, and I'm not arguing in favor of one side or the other, by the way, Italian-Croatian side, went there and they celebrated the whole thing. It was a great party to remember what? The 200 years since the founding of the company. The question is, what company are you celebrating? Because in 1821, the company was founded as Luxardo, wasn't Maraska, which did not exist until 1947. Can you follow me for a second? So the irony is you got a Bosnian-controlled company in Croatia, and they celebrate the Croatianness of the product. This is interesting as well. And they celebrate 200 years of a company which was founded in 1947. So I leave it with you to look at how nationalism affects the way we think. And I'm not taking sides here. Okay? It's just a thought. It's just crazy if you think it carefully. Okay? Also, it's an anachronism.
It's just an excuse for a party.
Exactly. I think you should look at it that way, I suppose. A good excuse for a party and to actually, for the party, I suppose, controlling the people. And okay, so that's why I said appetito to maraschini. An interesting thing, I'm aware that the markets for both companies are slightly different. So, I don't think they will really get on very well with one another. And there are good reasons, and it goes back not because of competition, but because of this. I wouldn't call it animosity because I'm not familiar with the situation, but certainly, it's not a nice situation when you see this happening and, and the excuse of the war, then you take somebody else's property. Well, see now in other parts of the world, with the current war in Ukraine, similar problem. Now, we move down to the last bit because we want to eat something sweet at the end. We started with a very bitter thing in Romagna, traveling through the Alps, getting some wine without tasting that way. Now, I'm sorry about if you want to close those, pull those pictures back so you may be able to see better. Can you try please to see can you see this picture? Okay, now the picture was only taken 2 days ago, okay, and it was actually made fresh, a friend of mine. Now, this is called pinca. Now, some people say, what is pinca? Now, interestingly enough, in Italy now, there is a lot of interest in a food called pinca, with the S. Pinca romana. And I looked up the dictionary. Neologism, 2020 was first recorded. That's very, very new. Or 2018, pinceria as well, a place where you eat this kind of thing. Now, there are a lot of debates about the origin of words, but we know that pizza and pinca basically are the same thing, except that today pizza has evolved into what we know, anything, including the tail on top, and the pineapple. But pinca as well, also called pizza. There are different names, fugaca, okay. Also in Montenegro, so what we're moving down to Boka Kotorska. Boka, like Boke, so it's nothing else than Boke or Boke in Venetian. Kotorska from Kotor or Katar, okay. Except that Google, again, calls it Bay of Kotor. And I say, had they got good geographers at Google? I doubt. If you define a bay, that's not a bay. And in fact, Jules Verne described it as a ganglion of 6 or 5 different basins, and some of them are so narrow, which they look like a lake. In fact, the water is sometimes fresh water, and mostly, well, it's a combination of salt water and fresh water because of the amount of rain. So, in this area, which is sheltered in what is now Montenegro, there is also a small Italian community, at least they call themselves this way. Or they call themselves Croats. Why? Because they're Catholics. So Croat or Italian means often they're Catholics. In a country which has become Montenegro put together, you got the south, which is Albanian and Muslim. And then you got the Montenegrin Orthodox and the Serbian side. As you know, the two Orthodox churches are very different, and they actually argue all the time.
But one thing pulls them together: food. So although they celebrate Easter at a different time of the year, so in this area, this is why I'm going to make you laugh a bit. Can you read that? What is the interesting thing is that, this is why I don't want to actually start with bitter things. I want to finish off with something sweet. The interesting thing here is the local people have, because of the port, the sea basically was the lifeblood of this area, because the John Morris, Jan Morris, was it? Jan Morris wrote, you remember Morris?
Yes.
Yeah. This kind of cut off, describes this area which more or less is cut off in Montenegro, and there used to be only one mule track going up. And the road, the existing road, is actually very, very dangerous because and it goes up steep into the mountains in what is known as Old Montenegro. And Montenegro is a Venetian word, Black Mountain, because of the forest. But Old Montenegro was on the coast. Now, why I'm saying this? Because on the coast, a lot of people were attracted to the richest parts of the area, and they came down. So they came down with their own traditions, their food, and so forth. But one thing that survived, despite the fact that the local Catholics, from a majority, became a minority, one food, makes everybody happy. At Easter, in fact, you celebrate different Easters, yeah? So the party is longer for everybody because you have the pinca, the one you've just seen up here, okay? And the pinca is also known in Italy as pinca triestina. So is it Italian? Well, in Austria, pinca as well exists. Osterfladen in other parts of of the German-speaking world, but it also exists in Corfu. So what is it? So we have to be careful, and of course in Italy it says it's ours. Well, I want to go very, very slowly here. It means that the phenomenon of the pizza, or these, flatbread basically, isn't confined to a place, I'm afraid. It has developed into different directions, and it could be served for Easter. It looks like hot cross buns in many ways, if you think about that. Yeah? And there is an analogy to it. It could be of all shapes and sizes and taste, savory and sweet. In Artusi, there are only 3 types of pizza, and it's all sweet. Yeah, he actually was forced to acknowledge very late to actually add the pizza napoletana as a savory dish later on. Okay, but that's a different story. Now, what is interesting here is, despite the arguments here, because in this area there's potential for tension, but luckily there hasn't been war. There's been a lot of interference from external powers. But what is actually one element nobody disagrees with is the food. And I think the question, though, is this Italian food, as some ethnographers published a couple of years ago? They say the food in the Boka Kotorska is Italian. I say, what? And why? What does it mean to be Italian? This is the question here. Can you just describe the food as saying that we know is shared because of the ports? Can you call it sea cultures at all? Not because the nation is bad in itself, but because you're just making a statement. You're saying, this is mine, as opposed to yours. As we've seen with the maraschini, we've seen it with the merenda. So sorry, I was about to say something here. Now, what is interesting, in the Boka Kotorska, they created an interesting word for foodies. Bonkulovići. Bon, or not good, and kulo. Bottom. Why? Imagine this food you eat, and as you know in the past, fat people were associated with the rich. So eating a lot was a sign or part of thing like the gout. People suffering, and it's interesting here. So the bonkulovići, could be from different religious backgrounds, including actually faiths if you want. And despite the fact that these communities often do not talk to one another. This is interesting thing. They actually been arguing since the independence of Montenegro. One thing that was, they love together is their own food cultures. So, to finish off, I'm actually 5 minutes late. Cuisines with the national and regional labels are a lazy way of approaching food. Yes, they are. Except we all love it. TripAdvisor, and the first thing you do is what? National cuisine. What does it mean? I don't know. What if they serve you sweet pizza? You're thinking actually it's a joke. No. We should know that pizza wasn't always the savory thing. Sea and mountains unite, nations divide. It's actually a strong statement of mine. It's not always the case, but ports is where you've got the goods coming in and out. And you notice in cities where you've got ports, big ports, historical ports, you always have quite an interesting mixture of food and offer in many ways. Genoa, you name it. Okay.
nations tend to divide because they want to say this is mine and this is not yours, on no evidence whatsoever, because nations are a recent invention. Now, but what we've seen today is that gastronationalism is becoming a problem, because the moment you label a food with a national thing, you're excluding the others from making this. And what basis have you got historically? None. And this is my final reflection. Now, thank you very much for coming today. Sorry. Any questions?
Yeah, any questions? I've got an observation that I've got this friend in the Veneto, and his eating habits seem to be ritualistic. And he told me about this this dish, which he thought was fantastic. And it's basically a brodo, and you mix a flour and breadcrumbs or whatever with herbs and cheese, and you put it into a pot that's got holes in the bottom, and this pot has on it a lever with a piston, and you squeeze this stuff into slowly. I didn't do it slowly, like that, and it turned into a mush. It was awful. So I went back to him and he told me how to do it properly. Basically, you squeeze this thing very slowly and you allow it to cook as it comes out of the pot. So, and I've got this in the cupboard at home, and I'm always saying to him, I'll try it again. Because I haven't got it right yet, I'm sure. So thank you very much for that. It's thought-provoking and very interesting. So the next time we go to the Italian, I'll be in confusion, won't I?
Well, it's best to be confused and be happy, though.
Yeah. Any questions?
What do you think about in Italy, the DOC, DOCGs, AOCs, Stilton cheese, cheddar cheese as a way of protecting?
Well, again, the principle, this is interesting what is debated in that book called Gastronationalism, because this is actually what the book talks about. That originally, these denominations were created in order to encourage, if you want, producers from from artisan producers, for example, small producers, to do these interesting things. But it has turned into a completely different thing, because it's completely. So the main purpose was to promote. Now is to defend. And I think this is one of the problems. In the moment we had a case study with the pizzoccheri a few years ago in Italy. Now, pizzoccheri della Valtellina can only be made in the province of Sondrio according to the law. And there was a producer which had been producing before the law existed, elsewhere, near Bergamo. There was a long court case. I don't want to talk about the actual specific names, but it involves a very big producer. And eventually, the one which was actually in the province of Bergamo lost. And they said, we offer you to move your production. So imagine this, in the same country, same region, even, to our area, and then you can continue production. Yeah, I haven't followed to the end of this, but you can imagine this, you actually have jobs at stake here. In the name of what? In my opinion, it's like a religion in many ways, has become like worshipping. This is an example where I think it is getting out of hand. Because instead of thinking of innovating all the time, you're actually creating the myth. In fact, when we talk about this kind of food, the notion of traditional Italian food wasn't even born in those days. It was born much later. I think, if I'm not wrong, in the 1930s it started to actually establish the idea of tradition, which is based on this first, in inverted commas, Bible, okay, Artusi, which is why I think you should read it, because we just open eyes and understand. And Artusi wasn't a nationalist, far from that. The only issue here, and I'm finished with it, is he only included the food of the bourgeoisie. And then with the Italian food as a peasant food. No, I'm afraid this is actually the food of the bourgeoisie. Which explains why, for example, like pizza for the poor wasn't included. Sorry.
Any other questions?
Could I just ask one quick question? Do you think that what Italy has as its food political system connected with food that we have in this country as a class system? Because there seems in this country to be no interest whatsoever in food as seen in that part of.
Well, I think that in this country we are less dogmatic about food. I think this is the way.
It's less interested.
well, less dogmatic in many ways, because people have been affected by production of Stilton. I follow this thing because I did some work on this, and obviously were affected badly by exiting the European Union. So they actually suffered a lot because they actually lost the ability now to actually be. I don't know what the law looks like these days, but being PDOs, that's gone out of So anybody potentially could create a Stilton, and that puts you at disadvantage. So look at it this way. So from possibly. People at large are not interested, but people producing, I think, they are quite keen on this because small producers, imagine cheese producers across the region, there are quite a lot of small producers, and if their product can be copied or counterfeited elsewhere, they won't have a market. So there is, but I agree with you in a sense that here, the dogma isn't that strong in a way regarding that. So there isn't a dogma about food, and perhaps more for the drinks, I should say. If you enter whiskey, for example, for Scotland, I think there is a big thing when, imagine you put the wrong letter in, you've got the Irish variety or the American one, and you're in trouble, I think.
So, do you approve of the term, much beloved of tourism, a local speciality?
Well, I'm not about. I'm not God. As I said, from a scholarly point of view, I just look at it and you think, what does local mean?
Yeah.
Even with territoriale, territorio, where's the boundary of this territory?
Yes.
And this is where we draw the lines in every sense of the word. And this is where it gets very difficult.
Yeah.
So it's a marketing tool, but I call it
Exactly.
for fools. It's a marketing fool, I think, rather than tool. Because eventually it sells you this idea of the tree, the cypress tree, are you with me? And it gives you the idea of a brand in a way, of a landscape, which is like a brand. And this is exactly, they've been very good at saying this, because people say but there was in Italy, people copy us. But look at it from a different perspective. People buy your stuff. So it means it's successful. So it means the marketing is very good. If people copy you, it means that you're very good. But then we become dogmatic. Then you start having problems, I think, because people start thinking, why are you so dramatic? Years ago, there was a court case about, 20 years ago, in this country, the Consorzio di Parma, Prosciutto di Parma, did not allow a British company to slice the ham in this country.
Oh.
So that's, I was aware of this because a student of mine mentioned this case. So if I answer your question, and any more questions? Or?
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.